A clay tablet sat in a kiln at Ugarit, still mid-firing, when the city ended. French excavators found the tablets with partially fired clay. The destruction had come during a working day. The tablets were in the process of being preserved at the moment they were no longer needed. The letter was from the king of Alasia, the island we now call Cyprus. It recorded enemy ships sighted at sea. The Alasia king urged Ugarit's king to strengthen his defences and guard his cities. Around 1185 before the Common Era, Ugarit's king, Amurapi, received the warning. The letter was never answered. Ugarit was a port city on the Syrian coast. Its scribes produced an archive spanning approximately 215 years, from around 1400 to 1185 before the Common Era. Around 1500 cuneiform tablets survive. Most are in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Late Bronze Age. The rest are in Ugaritic for local administration. Together they constitute a continuous record of the Late Bronze Age international system at work. Itamar Singer surveyed Ugarit's political history in the Handbook of Ugaritic Studies. He found no signs of political disintegration in the years before the city's destruction. The archive shows standard diplomatic correspondence, standard administrative records, standard commercial transactions, up to the end. The Alasia letter sits within this archive. The sender reports that his own territory had already been struck. Enemy ships had been sighted. The count varies between translations. Some read 7 ships, others 20. The Alasia king urged Ugarit to fortify without delay. Running alongside this warning, the archive preserves a separate body of correspondence. Grain request letters from the period of Amurapi, Ugarit's last king, who reigned from around 1215 to 1185 before the Common Era. These letters are published in part in a collected edition of Ugaritic texts edited by Jon and Arnaud. They document Ugarit appealing to external partners for food supplies. One letter in Amurapi's name describes the shortage in terms that leave no room for diplomatic hedging. The state requires grain delivered by ship. Survival of the population depends on it. These are not formulas. The correspondence records a functioning administrative system measuring its own failure to provision itself. Both sets of documents survive because the destruction stopped them mid-process. The archive did not survive as an organized collection. It survived because the city ended while administration was still running. Why was the warning unanswered? Singer's finding carries a specific implication. The Ugarit archive was operating normally in its final hours. That is not evidence of stability. It is evidence that the system was still receiving and processing signals. The failure was not communicative. Something else had already failed. Ugarit's military capacity was gone before the warning arrived. Suppiluliuma II, last Hittite king from around 1207 before the Common Era, had demanded troops and ships from Ugarit for Hittite military operations. The Ugarit archive records compliance. Trevor Bryce documents this obligation structure in the Kingdom of the Hittites. Vassal states in the Hittite network were required to commit military assets to the suzerain's campaigns on demand. Ugarit had done so. Its garrison and naval capacity were absent on Hittite service when the Alasia letter reached its coast. The naval absence carries a specific weight. The warning described enemy ships at sea. Ugarit was a maritime port. The answer to a threat sea was a naval answer. That answer no longer existed. What remained was an administrative apparatus still running and a king writing letters requesting grain. In Amurapi's own grain request correspondence, he states that his troops and chariots are absent on Hittite service. He states that enemy ships have now arrived at his shores. He states that he can find no grain. These are not 3 separate problems. They are the same problem expressing itself in 3 registers: military, territorial, and logistical. The state was being depleted on 2 axes simultaneously. Military capacity had been drawn outward. Food supply was failing internally. Ugarit was not alone in this condition. The Hittite suzerain itself was sending emergency grain requests to Egypt. The Egyptian state was managing military confrontations along its northern approaches. The 2 parties Ugarit might have called on had no surplus capacity to give. Each step in this sequence was locally rational. Ugarit complied with the suzerain's legitimate demand. It requested food from partners still nominally functional. The Hittite court made similar calculations. The Egyptian court made similar calculations. None of these decisions was, in isolation, a failure. The failure was in the accumulation. Each transaction removed a portion of the network's response capacity. The network held its shape long after its capacity to act had been dismantled. Letters still arrived, administration still functioned, kings still wrote and received correspondence. Cline identifies this as a property of tightly integrated networks. Disruption does not weaken the system gradually. It amplifies. The Alashia king's warning reached Ugarit accurately. It described a real threat. It arrived at the right address. The city that received it had already been emptied of the instruments it would have needed to respond. In the year 408 of the Common Era, Alaric led the Visigoths to the walls of Rome. He sent demands to the court at Ravenna. The court was under Emperor Honorius. The court received the demands. The communication system functioned. The response infrastructure did not. In August of 408, Honorius had ordered the execution of Stilicho. Stilicho was the Western field commander, the military instrument that would have managed Alaric's threat. The decision to remove him predated Alaric's arrival at Rome's walls. Peter Heather, in The Fall of the Roman Empire, documents this sequence in detail. The failure of the communication chain between court and frontier was not a failure of information. The court knew what Alaric wanted. The failure was in what the communication reached. The Senate in Rome and the court at Ravenna were functionally separated. Alaric held the road between them. The two seats of the Western government could not coordinate through channels that Alaric occupied. Communications from the Senate requesting action were received at Ravenna. They produced no army. The Senate, isolated in Rome, had in fact negotiated with Alaric directly during the first siege. Zosimus records what Alaric demanded and received: gold, silver, silk robes, and pepper. The Senate paid. Honorius, from Ravenna, then repudiated the agreement. The communication chain between Rome's two governing seats was not merely interrupted, it was operating against itself. One seat negotiated while the other invalidated the negotiation. Alaric returned in 409. He returned again in 410. The court at Ravenna received the signal 3 times across 2 years. The instrument that would have responded had been removed before the first siege began. Rome was not Ugarit. The timescales differed, the distances differed, the political structures differed, but the structural condition was identical. A communication system continued to process distress signals accurately. The capacity to respond had already been dismantled. The pattern has a name. When a warning reaches a system whose response capacity has been dismantled, the signal changes nothing. The network can receive the distress call. It cannot answer it. This is the unanswered distress call. It is not a failure of information. It is not a failure of communication. It is a structural failure. The response mechanism is removed before the threat that requires it arrives. Ugarit demonstrated this in 1185 before the Common Era. Rome demonstrated it in 410 of the Common Era. The distress call is received. What receives it is already gone. Subscribe to Omen History. New episodes daily.